Future wife, I have to tell you something my father did a few weeks ago. Something he finally confessed to me over the weekend. Something that honestly stunned me when I first heard it. Though the more I've sat with it, the more it's actually filled me with a quiet, overwhelming warmth I don't think I fully expected. My father looked into you, future wife. Quietly, carefully, without either of us knowing, he spent weeks learning everything he could about the woman his son had fallen in love with. And what he discovered has changed the way our entire family sees you, and honestly, the way I see this relationship too. Wanna tell you exactly how I found out, because the way it came out matters almost as much as what he actually discovered. We were sitting together after dinner this past Saturday, just the two of us. The way we sometimes do when my mother steps away to call my sister, and my father got quiet in that particular way he does right before he says something important. Something he's clearly been holding on to for a while. He set his glass down and looked at me for a long moment, before he finally said, "I need to tell you something, and I owe you an apology first." Future wife, I had no idea what was coming. I assumed maybe he wanted to talk about something related to work or some old family matter neither of us had properly addressed. But instead he told me that a couple of months ago, worried in that particular protective way fathers sometimes get about their children, he'd started quietly asking around about you. Not anything invasive, he assured me quickly, nothing that crossed any real lines, just careful conversations with mutual acquaintances. A look at your public presence online, the kind of ordinary due diligence he said he wished someone had done for him before certain difficult relationships in his own past. I felt a flash of something complicated, hearing that future wife, somewhere between mild embarrassment and genuine curiosity, wondering what exactly he'd found, wondering how I should feel about my father conducting this kind of quiet research on the woman I love without either of us knowing about it. But future wife, what he told me next completely reshaped whatever complicated feeling I started with into something entirely different, something closer to overwhelming gratitude, both toward you and toward him, for caring enough to actually do this in the first place. He told me he talked to an old colleague of his who happened to know someone at your workplace, and that person had told him, unprompted, about a moment months before you and I ever met, when you'd noticed a coworker quietly struggling, someone new, overwhelmed, clearly out of their depth, in a role they'd only recently started. And future wife, this person told my father that you'd taken it upon yourself, without any obligation, without anyone asking you to spend your own lunch breaks for weeks, helping that coworker catch up, teaching them everything you knew, never once mentioning it to anyone, never once looking for recognition or credit for the kindness you were quietly offering someone who needed it. Take your future wife. My father told me that story with tears actually forming in his eyes. This man who rarely shows that kind of emotion so openly. And he said, I knew right then, hearing that story, that you were exactly the kind of person our family needed. Someone who does the right thing, even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. He said that specific quality, quiet generosity, without any need for recognition, was the exact thing he'd always hoped I would find in whoever I eventually chose to spend my life with. And hearing that it existed so genuinely in you, confirmed by someone who had absolutely no reason to exaggerate or flatter you, for my father's benefit, meant more to him than almost anything else he could have discovered. I sat there, future wife, completely undone by that story, because you'd never told me about that coworker, never mentioned helping someone through weeks of quiet, patient mentorship during your own precious lunch breaks. I asked you about it later that same night, carefully, without revealing yet what my father had told me, and you brushed it off so easily, future wife, told me it wasn't really anything significant, just someone who needed a little help, and you happened to have the time to offer it. But future wife, that casual dismissal, that complete lack of any need to make it into something bigger than it actually was in your own mind, only confirmed everything my father had discovered, even more completely. I think about how easy it would have been for you to mention that story yourself, future wife, to use it as evidence of your own good character during some early conversation when we were still getting to know each other, the kind of story people sometimes share deliberately to make a good impression. But you never did, future wife, not once. In all these months we've been together, you simply lived that kindness quietly, privately, without ever needing anyone to witness it or acknowledge it. And future wife, I think that's exactly the kind of character that can't be performed or faked. The kind that only shows up authentically when someone genuinely believes kindness is worth offering, even when there's absolutely nothing to be gained from it. My father told me more that evening too, future wife. Other small things he'd learned during those quiet weeks of careful research. Small confirmations of character that individually might seem unremarkable, but together painted a complete, undeniable picture of exactly who you actually are, underneath the version I already knew and loved. He told me about a mutual friend who mentioned how you always remember people's birthdays, not just close friends, but distant acquaintances too, small gestures of thoughtfulness that most people forget to extend once a friendship moves beyond its earliest, most attentive stage. He told me about someone else who mentioned how patient you'd been with an elderly neighbor who needed help navigating some confusing paperwork, spending an entire afternoon on something that had nothing to do with you at all, simply because you happened to notice someone struggling and couldn't bring yourself to walk past without offering help. Future wife, hearing all of this laid out so completely, confirmed by people who had no reason to lie or exaggerate on your behalf, did something important to me that I don't think I properly understood until my father told me about it directly. It gave me evidence, external, undeniable evidence of exactly the character I already believed you possessed based on my own experience of loving you these past several months. And, future wife, I think there's something powerful about having that internal belief confirmed by outside sources. Something that settles a certainty even deeper than the certainty I already carried on my own. Future wife, I want to tell you about the rest of that conversation with my father. Because there was one more thing he told me that night. Something that took me completely by surprise. Something that I think explains exactly why he felt compelled to do this quiet research in the first place. More than any general protective instinct fathers naturally carry toward their children's relationships. He told me, future wife, about his own history, something I'd only ever heard fragments of before. Something he'd never fully explained until that Saturday evening. Before he met my mother, he told me he was engaged once, briefly, to someone else. Someone who seemed wonderful on the surface, charming and warm in every social setting they navigated together. But my father said he never did the kind of careful checking he wished he had. Never talked to people who actually knew her outside the context of dating him specifically. And by the time the engagement ended, badly, painfully, he'd learned things about her character that completely contradicted the person she'd presented to him during their entire relationship. Future wife, my father told me that experience shaped him more deeply than he'd ever properly admitted to me before. Taught him a hard lesson about the difference between how someone behaves when they're actively trying to win your affection and how they actually behave in their ordinary, unwatched life. And he said, watching me fall for you, watching how quickly and completely I seemed to trust you, he felt that old protective instinct rise up in him, not because he doubted my judgment specifically, but because he understood, painfully, how easy it is for anyone to be genuinely fooled by someone skilled at performing goodness, without actually possessing it underneath. I think that context changed everything about how I understood his decision to research you quietly, future wife. It wasn't about distrust of me, or even really distrust of you specifically. It was about an old wound, one he's apparently carried for decades. Finally finding a productive outlet in protecting his son from potentially repeating a painful mistake he'd made himself all those years ago. And future wife, understanding that context, I found myself feeling not embarrassed or uncomfortable about what he'd done, but genuinely moved, understanding exactly how much love was actually motivating his careful, quiet research this whole time. Then DearHer retold me something else too, future wife. Something that struck me even more deeply once I understood the full context of his own painful history. He said that during his engagement, all those years ago, he'd actually witnessed several moments where his fiancée at the time treated service workers poorly, dismissively, in ways that contradicted completely how warmly she treated him and their mutual friends. He said he'd noticed it quietly, uncomfortably, but talked himself out of taking it seriously, telling himself it was just a bad day, an isolated incident, nothing that reflected her true character. He said that decision, to ignore evidence right in front of him, because he desperately wanted the relationship to work, taught him one of the hardest lessons of his life, and he never wanted to watch me make that same mistake without at least trying to help me see clearly first. Future wife. That's why he specifically asked around about how you treat people who have absolutely nothing to offer you. People in positions where kindness costs something and receives nothing tangible in return. And future wife. Every single thing he discovered confirmed exactly the opposite of what he'd witnessed during his own painful engagement all those years ago. He found the co-worker you mentored quietly during your lunch breaks. He found the elderly neighbor you helped without any expectation of anything in return. He found, in conversation after conversation with people who had no particular reason to flatter you, a consistent pattern of genuine, unglamorous kindness, offered specifically in moments when no one important was watching closely enough to notice or reward it. I think about how different this story would have felt. Future wife, if my father's research had actually uncovered something concerning instead, some pattern that contradicted the woman I already believed you to be. I think about how devastating that would have been, not just for our relationship, but for my father too. Forced to deliver news he desperately wouldn't have wanted to deliver. Forced to potentially cause pain to protect me, the way he wished someone had protected him, all those years ago. Future wife, I'm so deeply grateful that instead, every single thing he discovered simply confirmed and deepened everything I already knew and loved about you, giving both of us, my father and myself, complete peace instead of the difficult, painful conversation this could have easily become. My mother came back into the room near the end of that conversation, future wife, and she immediately noticed something had shifted between my father and me, some emotional weight sitting in the room that hadn't been there before she left to call my sister. And when my father explained what he told me, briefly summarizing the whole story for her benefit, she started crying too. Future wife, this quiet, overwhelmed kind of crying that happens when something touches you more deeply than words can easily express. She told me she'd always hoped quietly, privately, that I would find someone whose character held up completely under this kind of careful scrutiny. Someone whose private, unwatched behavior matched exactly the warmth she'd shown publicly whenever our whole family had been together. Future wife, I think about my mother's tears often since that conversation, understanding now more clearly than ever exactly how much both of my parents have been quietly hoping for this specific outcome. Watching me date over the years, sometimes worrying privately about choices they never voiced concern about directly, always hoping eventually I'd find someone whose goodness ran as deep beneath the surface as it appeared on top. And future wife, I think knowing that both of my parents now have this kind of complete externally confirmed confidence in you means something enormous for our future together. Something beyond just my own personal certainty about who you are. I keep thinking about how strange and beautiful it is that my father's decades-old pain, carried quietly since before I was even born, ultimately became the reason he took the time to confirm something so wonderful about the woman I love. I think about how his painful history, something that could have easily made him bitter or overly suspicious of every relationship I ever brought home, instead transformed into this careful, loving protectiveness that ultimately gave both of us something precious, undeniable confirmation of exactly the character I already believed you possessed. Future wife, I don't think I could have imagined, going into that Saturday dinner, that the conversation would end with this much gratitude, this much emotional weight, this much confirmation of everything I already felt certain about in my own heart. Future wife, there's one more thing my father told me that night. Something he almost didn't mention. Something he said he'd debated whether to tell me at all, because it felt like it might be crossing some line even beyond the careful research he'd already confessed to. But future wife, once he'd already told me everything else, once the whole truth was already sitting between us in that quiet living room, he decided I deserved to hear this final piece too. He told me that during his research he'd actually reached out to your mother, briefly, carefully, through a mutual acquaintance who happened to know her from some community event years ago. He hadn't spoken to her directly, future wife, hadn't done anything as invasive as calling her himself, but he'd asked this mutual acquaintance, gently, what kind of person your mother was, what kind of household you'd been raised in. Understanding from decades of his own experience that character often traces back clearly to the values a person absorbed during childhood, whether they consciously realize it or not. And future wife, what he learned about your mother, second-hand as it was, moved him almost as much as everything he'd learned about you directly. He said this acquaintance described your mother as someone who spent years volunteering at a local shelter, quietly, consistently, long before it became anything fashionable or socially rewarded to do that kind of work. He said she was known in her community for taking in stray animals nobody else wanted, for cooking extra meals during hard winters specifically to share with elderly neighbors living alone, for showing up, reliably, whenever anyone in her community needed help without ever needing to be asked twice. Future wife, hearing that description, my father told me everything clicked into place for him completely. He said character like yours doesn't usually appear out of nowhere, doesn't usually develop in isolation from the environment someone grew up inside. He said watching a mother model that kind of quiet, consistent generosity for years teaches a child more effectively than any lecture ever could exactly what real character looks like in practice, day after day, in the unglamorous, unwatched moments that actually reveal who someone truly is underneath any performance they might offer in more visible settings. Okti, I think about your mother now, future wife, with an entirely new depth of appreciation, understanding more clearly than ever exactly where your own instinctive kindness actually comes from. Understanding that the coworker you quietly mentored, and the elderly neighbor you helped with paperwork, and the birthdays you never forget, all of it traces back to lessons absorbed so early, so consistently, that they became simply who you are, rather than any conscious choice you have to make deliberately each time an opportunity for kindness presents itself. Future wife, I want to meet your mother properly soon, more intentionally than we have so far, because I think understanding this piece of your history has made me want to thank her directly, want to tell her exactly what her example has meant to the woman I love, exactly how deeply that inherited generosity has shaped my own life since I met you. I think about all the small kindnesses you've shown me over these months, the patience during difficult days, the thoughtfulness in remembering things I mentioned only once, the quiet, consistent way you show up for me without ever needing recognition for any of it. And future wife, understanding now that all of that traces back to your own mother's example, feels like understanding an entire additional layer of who you actually are. My father told me one more small detail from that conversation with the mutual acquaintance. Future wife, something almost too tender to say out loud, but something I think you deserve to hear anyway. He said this acquaintance mentioned that your mother, even now, still calls occasionally to check on people she helped years ago. People who have long since moved on with their lives, no longer needing her assistance in any practical sense, but she still calls simply to make sure they're doing well, simply because she genuinely cares about the people she's helped. long after any practical need for that help has passed. Future wife, I think about that detail constantly since my father told me about it, because I recognize that same quality in you already. The way you still ask about people from earlier chapters of your life. The way you still check in on old friends, even when circumstances have naturally drifted you apart. The way caring about people never seems to have an expiration date for you. The way it does for so many others who move through relationships more transactionally, keeping people close only as long as they remain immediately useful or convenient. I think my father understood, sitting there telling me all of this, that he wasn't just confirming your character as an individual anymore. He was confirming an entire inherited legacy of goodness passed down from your mother to you. And future wife, I find myself wondering now about the children we might have someday, wondering whether that same legacy will continue passing down through generations. Whether some future daughter of ours might someday quietly help a struggling coworker or an elderly neighbor, having absorbed that same instinct for unglamorous, consistent kindness, simply by watching you live it out, day after day, the same way you apparently absorbed it from your own mother. Future wife. I called my own grandmother the day after that conversation with my father, wanting to share some of what I'd learned, wanting to connect this discovery to our own family's history of values passed down through generations. And she told me something that has stayed with me since. Something about how the best marriages aren't actually built between two individuals in isolation, but between two entire family legacies, finally meeting and choosing to grow together. She said watching those legacies align, watching two families who both apparently value the same quiet, consistent generosity, is one of the clearest signs she's ever witnessed that a relationship is built on something genuinely lasting, rather than something more fragile and superficial. I think about all of this now, future wife, sitting here trying to process everything my father discovered during those quiet weeks of careful research. Everything it revealed, not just about you individually, but about the entire family legacy you carry forward. So naturally, I think about how grateful I am that his own painful history, decades old, ultimately led to this moment, this confirmation, this deepening of everything I already believed about you and now understand even more completely. And future wife, I find myself wanting to know more, wanting to understand every piece of the history that shaped you into exactly the woman I've fallen so completely in love with. Wanting to trace every thread of kindness back to its source, understanding that loving you fully means understanding not just who you are, but everyone and everything that helped shape you into becoming her. Future wife, I finally told you everything last night. I want to tell you about that conversation now, because I think it belongs here. At the center of this whole story, the moment where I stopped simply reflecting on what my father discovered and actually shared it with you directly, watching your face as every piece of it landed for the very first time. I remember how nervous I felt bringing it up, future wife, unsure exactly how you'd react to learning that my father had quietly researched you for weeks without your knowledge, worried you might feel exposed or uncomfortable, knowing that conversations about your character had been happening behind your back, however well-intentioned they actually were. I sat you down carefully, told you I needed to share something important, and I watched a flicker of worry cross your face before I even started explaining, the natural anxious response to hearing that kind of serious opening line. But future wife, as I started telling you everything, starting with my father's own painful history, the engagement that taught him such a hard lesson decades ago, I watched your expression slowly shift from worry into something gentler, more understanding, as the full context became clear. And by the time I reached the part about the coworker you'd quietly mentored, you were already crying, future wife, softly, your hand covering your mouth the way it does whenever you're moved more deeply than words can immediately express. You told me you'd almost forgotten about that coworker entirely. future wife, that helping her through those difficult weeks had felt so unremarkable to you at the time, that you genuinely hadn't thought about it again until I brought it up. And future wife, that response, that genuine surprise at learning someone had noticed and remembered something you yourself had already forgotten, confirmed everything my father discovered even more completely than his original research ever could have on its own. I told you about your mother too, future wife, about the shelter she volunteered at, about the stray animals and the extra meals during hard winters. And future wife, I watched something different happen on your face during that part of the story, something closer to a complicated mixture of pride and grief, because you told me, quietly, that your mother had actually stopped that volunteer work a few years ago. Health complications making it impossible for her to continue the way she once had. And you said hearing someone else remember and honor that history, someone outside your immediate family, meant more to you than I could have possibly understood in that moment. Madam, future wife, I held you for a long time after that, both of us quiet, both of us processing everything that had just been laid bare between us. And eventually you told me something I hadn't expected, something that added an entirely new layer to everything my father had discovered. You told me that you'd actually learned from your own mother, specifically not to expect recognition for kindness, that she'd always taught you the moment you start doing good things, hoping someone notices. The good stops actually being about the person you're helping and starts being about your own need for validation instead. You said that lesson had shaped how quietly you tried to move through the world, deliberately avoiding any recognition for the kindness you offered, precisely because your mother had taught you that recognition wasn't actually the point. Future wife, hearing you explain that philosophy so clearly, understanding finally the deliberate intentionality behind your quiet generosity, rather than simply witnessing it as some instinctive, unconscious pattern, deepened my respect for you even further than my father's research alone had already accomplished. Because future wife, it's one thing to simply be naturally kind without much conscious thought behind it. It's an entirely different, more remarkable thing to have consciously chosen, deliberately, to keep that kindness quiet and unrecognized, understanding clearly why that choice actually matters more than the alternative. I asked you, future wife, whether learning that my father had researched you, however gently and well-intentioned, felt like a violation of that careful, deliberate privacy you'd built around your own generosity. And you thought about it for a long moment before answering, honestly, the way you always do. And you told me it didn't feel like a violation exactly, because the intention behind it came from love, rather than suspicion, from wanting to protect me, rather than wanting to expose or embarrass you. You said, if anything, it felt strangely meaningful, knowing that even the quiet, unrecognized kindness you'd tried so hard to keep private had still somehow reached people, still somehow mattered, even without you ever seeking that impact directly. Future wife, I think that response taught me something important about you that even my father's research hadn't fully captured. It taught me that your character isn't just about the kindness itself, remarkable as that kindness clearly is. It's about the wisdom underneath it, the clear understanding of exactly why quiet generosity matters more than performed generosity, the deliberate choice to keep doing good even when no external validation ever confirms that choice was worth making. Future wife, I don't think that kind of wisdom develops accidentally. I think it comes from exactly the kind of careful, intentional parenting your mother apparently provided, teaching you not just to be kind, but to understand deeply why that kindness needed to remain unattached to any expectation of recognition. When I think about my own future children now, future wife, imagining you teaching them these same lessons someday, patiently, consistently, the way your own mother taught you, I imagine watching you explain to some future daughter of ours exactly why helping someone quietly matters, more than helping someone publicly, exactly why the goal of kindness should never become about how it makes you look to others. Future wife, I think that's one of the greatest gifts I could ever imagine for our children. Growing up watching you model exactly the kind of wisdom my father's careful research accidentally uncovered. Learning from your example the same way you learned from your own mother's example decades before either of us ever met. We talked late into the night, future wife, working through every layer of this discovery together. And by the time we finally fell asleep, I felt something had deepened between us that went beyond even the deep connection we already shared before this entire conversation began. I felt like I finally understood not just what you do, but why you do it. Not just the surface pattern of your kindness, but the careful, deliberate philosophy underneath it, inherited from a mother who taught you something most people never fully learn, even across an entire lifetime. Future wife, I don't think I could have imagined, when my father first confessed his quiet research to me, that Saturday evening, that it would eventually lead us here, to this deeper, more complete understanding of exactly who you are, and exactly why I love you, as completely as I do. Future wife, my father asked to meet you properly this weekend, and I want to tell you about the conversation we had leading up to that invitation, because I think it matters just as much as the meeting itself once it actually happens. He called me 2 days after our original conversation, still clearly moved by everything he'd discovered, and he told me he wanted to sit down with you directly, not to investigate anything further. He was quick to clarify, but simply to know you properly now. To finally match the woman he'd learned so much about secondhand with the actual person his son has fallen in love with. I could hear something different in his voice. Future wife, a kind of nervous excitement. I don't think I've heard from him in years, maybe not since I was young enough that every milestone in my life still felt entirely new and uncertain to him. He told me he wanted to cook dinner himself. Something he rarely does anymore, leaving most of the cooking to my mother these days. But he said this particular dinner felt like it deserved that kind of personal effort, that kind of deliberate care, given everything he now understood about the woman joining our family. Future wife, I think about how much has shifted in just these past few days. How a single Saturday conversation has rippled outward into something that's touching my entire family now, reshaping how everyone understands and anticipates the future we're apparently building together, even before either of us has said the actual word engagement out loud yet. I think my father's research, however unconventional the method, has actually accelerated something that was probably always going to happen eventually anyway, simply giving all of us permission to feel the full weight and certainty of it, sooner than we might have otherwise allowed ourselves. I told my mother about the upcoming dinner too, future wife, and she immediately started planning what she wanted to contribute, insisting on making a dessert she usually reserves only for major family celebrations, something she hasn't made since my sister's engagement dinner a few years ago. Future wife, I don't think she said that comparison accidentally. I think without either of us formally announcing anything yet, my whole family has quietly started treating this upcoming meal with you as something significant, something worth the kind of preparation usually reserved for moments everyone already understands to be important milestones, even if the formal language for that milestone hasn't been spoken aloud between us yet. I think about how you'll feel walking into that dinner, future wife, knowing everything you now know about my father's research, understanding that this meal carries weight beyond just an ordinary family gathering. I want you to know clearly that nothing about that dinner is meant to feel like additional scrutiny, some final test layered on top of everything my father already learned during his weeks of careful research. I think, if anything, it's meant to be the opposite, a celebration of everything he already discovered, an opportunity for my whole family to finally express, directly to you, exactly how grateful they already feel for who you are and what you mean to our future together. Future wife, I called my sister too, telling her everything, wanting her perspective given her own experience, navigating this exact kind of family integration. A few years earlier, when she brought her own now husband home for the first time, she laughed a little when I told her about our father's quiet research, Said it sounded exactly like something he would do. Careful and protective in his own particular way. But she also told me something important. Something I think you should hear directly from me now. She said the fact that our father cared enough to do that research at all, the fact that he clearly loves me enough to want this kind of certainty before fully welcoming someone new into our family, is actually a testament to how deeply this family takes love and commitment. How seriously we all consider the people we choose to build our lives around. Too, I think about that perspective now, future wife, understanding my father's actions not as some strange overprotective quirk, but as an expression of exactly the kind of family values I hope will continue passing down to our own children someday. Careful, deliberate love, attention paid to character over surface charm, a willingness to do the sometimes uncomfortable work of ensuring the people we welcome into our closest circles are exactly who they present themselves to be. Not because we assume the worst of anyone, but because we understand how much genuinely rests on getting this particular kind of decision right. Future wife, I keep thinking about the actual dinner now, imagining how it will unfold, imagining my father finally meeting you properly, watching him connect in real time everything he already learned secondhand with the actual warmth and character he'll get to witness directly for the first time. I imagine him watching the way you naturally offer to help clear plates without being asked. The way I've watched you do in every family gathering we've attended together so far. I imagine him noticing the specific, genuine curiosity you bring to every conversation. The way you ask people thoughtful questions about their own lives instead of simply waiting for your turn to talk. Future wife, I think every single thing he already learned about you through his careful research is going to become even more vivid, even more undeniable, once he finally gets to witness it directly, in person, across an actual dinner table, instead of second-hand, through careful, quiet conversations with mutual acquaintances. But I think about the ring too. Future wife, though I haven't mentioned it to you directly yet in quite this way, sitting quietly in that drawer I've told you about before, waiting for exactly the right moment to finally make things official between us. And future wife, I think this upcoming dinner, this final piece of family integration, might actually be exactly the moment I've been waiting for. The confirmation from everyone who loves me most that this decision, already so certain in my own heart, is equally certain in the eyes of the family I'll be asking you to formally join. Future wife, I don't know exactly what will happen at that dinner this weekend, whether it will simply be a warm celebratory evening, or whether it might become something even more significant than either of us currently expects. But I know this. My father's quiet research, however unconventional its method, has given our entire family a gift neither of us fully anticipated when this whole story began. It's given us complete, undeniable confidence in exactly who you are, confirmed not just by my own certain heart, but by an entire careful investigation conducted out of love, out of protection, out of a father's deep desire to ensure his son finally found exactly the kind of partner worth building an entire lifetime around.